Hello everyone, Dr. Catalana here. The purpose of this presentation is to provide an overview of best practices for writing selected response items. So now that we really understand the importance of reliability and validity and fairness in the classroom assessment, now we'll kind of look at a couple of just best practices. I would really encourage you, don't think of these as a list of rules. If we had discussed this in the beginning of class, it would just feel like rules. But now you know I want to be valid, I want to be reliable, so it should be obvious what would produce the most valid and most reliable test question. So really this is more of an interactive class, and I have posted an activity that gives you various selected response items that are messed up and wrong for lots of reasons. So I would encourage you, before we get to that portion of this PowerPoint, I will tell you to stop and to go and try to do those practice questions alone and then come back and watch the rest of our video. So school's almost out, right? Of course, I had to give you some inspiration here. I used to love the show Recess when I was really little. That's probably dating me a little bit, but oh well. So here you have your learning objectives. So we're going to look at various types of test items. You should be familiar with all of these. You may have just never seen their quote fancy names here. So we'll look at different types of questions and then how to write them correctly. So we'll look at pros and cons of each type of test item that are listed above. And then toward the end, we'll practice rewriting them to make them better suited for use in the classroom. In other words, more valid and more reliable. So before I go much further into selected response, I did want to give you a brief overview of the difference between selected and constructed response. So any selected response item means that the students select the answer. So the answer is given to them somewhere on the page, whether it's A, B, C, or D, or it's a matching question, or true, false. They are selecting from potential answers and giving what they believe to be correct. Constructed response, such as in this scenario, the students are constructing their own answer. So there's nothing that they can use on the assessment itself that gives them the potential answer. So in this case, I'm choosing from existing options for selected response. In constructed response, I'm starting from scratch. Now, if we had more time, I would do definitely 1 week on selected and 1 week on constructed. Now we don't, unfortunately, which means you all should take my advanced assessment class so we can hang out some more. So today we are going to focus more on selected because there's a couple mistakes that I see over and over again that are pretty simple to fix. So I wanted to give you some pointers there. Selected response are very quick to grade. Constructed response take longer to grade. It is really hard, in my opinion, to write a quality selected response, and I'll tell you why later. It's a little easier, in my opinion, to write constructed response, but then you have the trade-off of more time to grade. So there's definite pros and cons. Typically, if we want higher order thinking, we are going to aim more for a constructed response, but I actually think there's a lot of higher order thinking in well-written selected response items as well. So just to give you a brief overview, but for our purposes today, we're focusing on selected response. Okay, so here is a multiple choice question. This is probably what you are most familiar with, right? So we've got the question, and then here are your potential answers. So something you may not know is that there are very specific terms here when we talk about a multiple choice question. So this portion up here is called the stem. Okay, so it's actually not called the question, it is called the stem. All of the potential answers, these are called your alternatives. So A, B, C, and D are your alternatives. Now, you guys probably know at this point that my cat's name is Maslow. This is a very throwback picture of me with her in my backpack, right? So in this case, my correct answer is Maslow, and the distractors are my incorrect options. Okay, so just brief overview, we have the STEM. Alternatives are A, B, C, and D, so all of them. Think A for all. And distractors are what are distracting me from my correct answer, which is C. The key to writing really quality multiple choice questions is writing really good distractors. A lot of times I see students and teachers write, here's an obvious correct answer, and then their distractors are just really wrong. And that's not very good for validity because then you're really not measuring much. You're just having the student pick a term they've seen before and not actually pick the term that they know to be correct from the STEM. So multiple choice. This one is very similar. In a food chain, rabbits are. So here's your STEM. What is our answer? Nope. What's the answer, guys? They're consumers. They're eating the carrot. This is called a binary choice simply because there are two options. Okay, so very similar. It's just that you have two options here. Now, that means you've got a 50% chance of getting this right. So you want to be careful with binary choice. I will use a binary choice if there aren't any plausible options for C and D. So you don't want to just fill up space. So I wouldn't say consumers, producers, dancers, and singers, because the student is clearly not going to pick dancers and singers, right? So only use binary choice if there's really just two plausible answers here. Okay, this one is a little bit more tricky. This is called a complex multiple choice. I'm sure you guys hate these, right? So this is when we have a lot of potential answers here, and then your alternatives are actually combinations. So which three are characteristics of plant cells but not animal cells? We've got 1, 2, and 5, 1, 3, 4, 2, 4, 6, 3, 5, 6. A complex multiple choice, it's good because you can measure a lot of things at once. But come on, guys, we've all taken these, and it's really hard to make sure you're circling the right answer. So I often will see students actually put the incorrect answer, but they knew the right thing to say. They just got mixed up. So careful with those. So let's think about some pros and cons. Multiple choice. Pros, they can really cover a lot of learning goals. The more that we cover our learning goals, the more reliability we have because it's consistent. We are providing students multiple opportunities to show what they know. They're easier to score. Now, that's always contradicted by the fact that I think they're harder to write, and you should not be just going online to a test bank. You need to make sure that you're writing your assessment items or at least reviewing them and changing them for your purposes. Cons, it gets pretty boring to do multiple choice items, and it's not always the best for student motivation. And there's a lot of guessing, right? So it's very simple to guess answers. If you do a classic multiple choice with 4 responses, that means your student has a 25% chance of guessing the correct answer. So that will impact the reliability and validity as well. Okay, now we have true or false. All right, this fun fact. True or false, only one face of the moon is ever seen from the Earth. This is actually true, the dark side of the moon. So true false question can be very helpful if, again, they're written well. I really like true-false questions if I require my students to fix the false response. That's actually a form of both selected and constructed response. Then, of course, we have a matching. Okay, so a little bit more terminology here with matching. These here that we are filling in the answers to, these are called your premises. Your options are called your responses. Okay, so just some more teacher vocabulary for you. Premises and responses. Now, another issue here is process of elimination, right? So if you don't know the capital of Utah, look at this, Sacrament, that's not right. If you don't know the capital of Utah, then if you know the first three, you can use process of elimination. So one thing that's really important for this is to always include more responses than you actually need. Okay, this question, these are my favorite types of multiple choice questions. I use these a lot in your quizzes. This is called an interpretive exercise. So what that means is I give you something to analyze. Like on your most previous quiz, I gave you a couple of just pictures from score reports and had you analyze those. And then it's a multiple choice about this. Typically, interpretive exercises are so good for higher order thinking. They are my favorite type of question. One thing that I would say with interpretive exercises is they take some time for students to complete. So I like to give at least 3 questions about each graphic because since it takes so long for the student to kind of get acclimated to the material, it's really helpful if you give them more than one question. Okay, so a couple more pros and cons. True, false, again, broader coverage of those learning goals, really easy to score. Cons, lack of motivation, right? It can get pretty boring. There's a 50-50 chance. It's usually a lot of lower order thinking. And something interesting that also happens with a true-false question is what we call the negative suggestion effect. Ooh, sounds fancy, right? All this means is that we really want to avoid writing anything from the teacher that's wrong. So you really don't want to give wrong facts or wrong information on a test. And the reason that is little kids particularly are going to just believe anything the teacher says. So if they see something like a triangle is a quadrilateral and they see that the teacher has written that, it can kind of mess with their mind and actually have a negative impact. So careful with true false in that case. Okay, matching. Again, broader coverage of your goals, very easy to score. Sometimes it's mainly just lower order thinking. If you're thoughtful about it, it can be higher order as well. Cons, I think that matching are difficult to write unless you're going to write just really lower order questions, which is sometimes appropriate. I don't really love to do matching because it does take a long time to write quality ones. Okay, and lastly, pros and cons for your interpretive exercises. Pros, like I mentioned earlier, they cover a lot of higher order thinking. And also they include graphics, which can be more interesting. If you think back to Universal Design for Learning, yes, remember this. They are easily giving those multiple representations, and they're easy to adapt as well. The main con is they're time taking. It takes a while to analyze them, which again is why I like to give more than one question about each of those graphics. And I think they're difficult to write, but very powerful. Okay, so at this point, I want you, if you have not already, to stop and look at that activity for writing quality multiple choice items. What that activity does is ask you to look through a couple of different sample multiple choice items and then think about how you would revise them to make them more effective. Okay, Again, do not view this as a checklist. View this as a method to increase the reliability and validity of these test items. Okay, so I've done my awkward pause, which means I'm trusting that you have looked through that activity or you already did it. I love this little graphic because it's such a good illustration of how multiple choice tests can be messed up. So are multiple choice exams an accurate measure of one's knowledge? A, yes. B, A and C. C, A and B. D, all of the above. Okay? Translation, that makes no sense. A lot of times we write really poor multiple choice questions. If it's not written well, we're really not measuring what we want to. So there's your issue with validity. And then we start making important decisions based on poorly written questions. So that's why I wanted to focus for this last week on selected response items, because I think it's so important to think about some specific guidelines as you're writing them for your future classroom. Again, do not memorize rules, all right? I told you you'd be tired of these words. You're always considering validity. Am I actually measuring what I think I am? Reliability, meaning am I positive that if students took this again, they would give me the same answer? Am I reducing my internal noise? Also, really important for fairness with your multiple choice items. So are you referencing something that had nothing to do with your learning goals and therefore putting some students at a disadvantage over others? Okay, so this is your first kind of guideline. Is the STEM meaningful by itself? Does it present a definite problem? Have you avoided repeating words or phrases in the options? So this is a not great example, right? And the reason is this part is the STEM. So blue crabs is the STEM. One of the first test taking strategies we teach for our younger students is cover up your alternatives and see if you can think of the answer. Then look at the alternatives. Which of these best matches your answer? It's a great test taking strategy. However, you can't do that if your STEM kind of sucks. In this case, it just says blue crabs. You have no idea what the question is about. So you want to change this so that the STEM is as meaningful as possible. Okay? So one way that I would change this is blue crabs can be found in the coastal waters of New Jersey. Which of these explains why the crab's outer shell helps it survive in its habitat? Okay, so now we have our alternatives, A, B, C, and D. Now there's a couple other issues with this STEM. Look at that first question. Blue crabs can be found in the coastal waters of New Jersey. That's cool, right? Are you telling me why that's important? Do I need that to answer the question? You may or may not. So it could be that the teacher here is trying to provide some context and help the student see what that shell might be used for. Most likely, though, it's not really necessary. So I would even say taking out that first sentence. So your first guideline, make sure the STEM is meaningful on its own. It should be very easy for your student to cover up A, B, C, and D and consider, okay, what do I think my answer is? And then choose the correct answer from the alternatives. Okay, number 2, is the STEM free from irrelevant material? Here we go. A boy is swimming 2 miles an hour down a river that is polluted and contains no fish, and the river is flowing at the rate of 3 miles per hour in the same direction as the boy is swimming. How far will the boy travel in 2 hours? I am so lost at this point. There is a lot of information here that we do not need, right? So if I were to change it, and again, you can change these in multiple ways. If a boy is swimming 2 miles per hour down a river that is flowing at the rate of 3 miles per hour, how far will the boy travel in 2 hours? Okay. Now, one thing I do want to point out here, because usually this produces some discussion with the students of, well, what about we want our students to learn to pick out what's relevant? Well, that's great if it's your learning objective. If your learning objective is that you're encouraging the students to sift through a lot of information and find what is needed, then that's totally fine. I will say, though, usually we want that irrelevant material to still be related academically to the content, like giving the rate of the wind or giving the boy's weight. So something else that's more mathematically related. So it may not be relevant to solving the problem at hand, but it's not super irrelevant like a river that is polluted and contains no fish. A good example of that is for those practice large-scale assessment analysis that you did last week. I gave you sample standardized tests that had a lot of information you didn't need. And that was because my goal of that activity is really to boost your confidence in looking for what is the most important information through all of this kind of messy student data. Okay, number 3, have negatively stated stems and options been avoided? Which of the following is not a safe driving practice on icy roads? So I can't say that it's possible to never use something that has the word not, right? Of course, you've seen me have quiz questions that are negatively worded, but you want to avoid them as much as possible. And that's because when you ask which of the following is not true or is not correct, you're asking your students' minds to work backwards. So sometimes they're necessary, and if they are, then you need to do a couple things. First off, you really need to highlight, bold, emphasize that word not. Make it annoyingly obvious. And second, arrange your test so that all of those items would be together. So usually if I have those which of the following is not type questions, then I will put all of those at the very end of a quiz, because once your mind gets to that point of thinking in the opposite, it's hard to get out. So I like to end with them all together at one. Now, why? Because that way I'm getting a better understanding of what you really know. So I'm getting a more valid response. I don't want to get an answer that you knew the right answer, but you got messed up because your brain was tired. That wouldn't be as valid. Okay, so it's not just a rule, it's a way of increasing my validity. So here's a good way of switching this. All of the following are safe driving practices on icy roads, except. Okay, are all options grammatically consistent with the stem? So, in most commercial publishing of a book, galley proofs are most often used. Page proofs precede galley proofs for minor editing. That makes no sense. To help isolate minor defects prior to printing of page proofs. I don't know what it means, but it grammatically works. They can be useful for major editing or rewriting. That doesn't make sense grammatically. And publishers decide whether a book is worth publishing. So here's the catch here, guys. I know the answer is B because it's the only one that is grammatically correct. However, I have no idea what this question means. So I just earned points, but it's not measuring my content knowledge. It's measuring my knowledge of grammar. So it's not valid. So make sure that all of your options are grammatically consistent. So this is just one way that I would propose fixing it. Notice that these are lowercase right here, guys, because I've written the stem in a way that the sentence will just continue on. which means you do need the period there. Okay. Grammatically consistent again. David wants to measure how fast different insects can crawl. He must have a ruler to help him find the speed. Another important tool for David to find would be, okay, a clock with a second hand. Is that grammatically correct? It is, but it's missing the period. So most likely a student wouldn't recognize that, but technically it's not grammatically correct. B is definitely not grammatically correct. Doesn't make sense to add a whole sentence there. Long sticks with brushes on the end. And then, all caps, a thermometer with degrees Fahrenheit. Let's not yell at our students. So what's actually the correct response here? It's A. Ooh, hello. Which means I need to add the period. And long sticks with brushes on the end is not grammatical because this is an uppercase and I'm completing the sentence. Now again, your students aren't going to notice that, but there's no way they're putting the "I'm yelling at you" answer. This should go unsaid, but please do not write your tests in all caps. That would drive you nuts, so don't drive your students nuts. Okay. So here's a way of completing this and making it correct. Okay, here we go. Are options plausible, meaning realistic, and homogeneous, meaning they're similar? Which of the following substances is the hardest? Diamond, glass, grits, my spouse's head. Guys, automatically we know C and D are not correct, which means this is really a binary choice item. I'm really just giving students two options, which means they have 50% chance of just guessing it correctly. So think about, again, how that impacts your validity. So here's a way of making this better. Iron and steel, a lot more plausible. Okay, are all options approximately the same length? So it is important to keep those alternatives the same length. Which of the following is an example of a diagnostic assessment? You should know this. Diagnostic, a pretest. So right here, we've got literally 3 words and then all the way to 3 lines. So the reason you want to keep your options about the same length is a lot of students will think, oh, well, the longest one is the most complicated. And obviously the most complicated alternative is correct, which is not always the case. Also, our eyes are just kind of drawn to what doesn't match. So my eyes are automatically, in this case, drawn to the pretest, meaning I'm more likely to actually answer the shortest one in this case. So here's a good way of improving this. Now, don't drive yourself crazy. I remember when I first started teaching, I would get really obsessed with this. As long as they're pretty much the same, you're fine. My general standard is I try to keep them to be the same amount of lines. You'll see I didn't even do that here for alternative A. But they're pretty much the same in that there's not one that just stands out. Okay. Is there only one correct or clearly best answers? Or best answer, rather. You want to really avoid overlapping options. So this question just kills me. When counting, 9,999 comes before, well, it comes right before 10,000, but it us also come before 100,000, so we've got overlapping options. There could be more than one. The number that comes directly after is. Okay, so see what we did to fix that. Now, it is possible, in fact, I do this often, which of the following is the best solution. I really write the best just for clarity purposes, meaning there's really one answer I'm looking for. But again, if I do an item analysis and it looks like I've done something wrong, then I'll have my students go back and explain their responses. Okay, is vocabulary suited to maturity of the students? Fourth grade test item. Magellan's primary contribution to world culture is that he was the first to circumnavigate the globe, ascertain the Atlantic Ocean, disembark on the American continent, inquire after the fountain of youth. My kind of sarcastic tone is geared towards this really higher level vocab. It's just too high for the students. And what that's doing is it's impacting the validity. So they could know the correct answer, but not know the vocabulary. So here's a better way of writing that for the fourth grade level. Okay, so this is a checklist that I think would be helpful to print off for yourself in terms of how to write quality selected response items. Never in this world would I ask you to memorize this. I do, however, like the option that you could print it off, have it kind of on your desk as you're writing assessments in the future. It is very helpful, but again, each of these checklist items are really just a manner to improve validity, reliability, and fairness. So hopefully this quick little work session has given you some hints. As you're going further in your study in the College of Education, you will have more and more opportunity to write your own assessments, particularly in your methods classes. So this is one of those materials that I've had my students tell me they come back to for sure. That was your checklist for selected response, specifically for matching items, which are a type of selected response. So you know what, just for clarity, I'm going to write that in there for writing matching items, also a selected response. Okay, so those are just kind of two important slides that I would print off if I were you. Particularly this one I think is really helpful. And then if you see yourself using a lot of matching items, this would be helpful as well. Okay, again, guys, just remember, you have your knowledge of these core foundational topics. You know, I want to measure what I think I'm measuring. I don't want to accidentally measure my students' reading level and not math, right? And also, I want to make a learning environment where students can do their best. I don't want them to be freaked out, internal noise. I don't want to be distracting them, external noise. I also want my students to be well prepared, fairness, and I don't want to put some students over others in the case of opportunity to learn. All right, so you know this material. Really the purpose of this presentation is to help you see how now that you understand the foundations of assessment theory, assessment doesn't look like this checklist of do's and don'ts. It's really just a matter of these are some strategies to make really effective assessments. Okay, good to talk to y'all, and of course I'm always here if you've got questions.